Fairfield County, Connecticut is an affluent bedroom community north of New York City, where residents enjoy the peace and quiet.
It's very old-time Americana. It's almost like Mayberry in a way.
For Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin, it was the ideal place to build their garbage pickup company, J&J Refuse.
Jeffrey and Jeanette had a family-run small business involving picking up refuse in several of the towns in Fairfield County.
That was not a glamorous business, but it was an honest, hard-working business at which they succeeded and excelled. And through that, they earned, on a harder path than most, a highly respected position in a community that tends to be a more professional, white-collar community.
Jeanette did like the bookkeeping for J&J. She was employed outside that business where she worked in the Weston school system.
She was in the library whenever I would go in, and she was a busy bee, but she would always take time to chat. She was very outgoing and friendly.
Jeffrey and Jeanette had two sons, Kyle and Taylor.
Family was really important to him, and Jeanette. They were very involved in their church. They were very involved in their children.
In high school, Jeffrey and Jeanette encouraged their sons to participate in competitive sports, and both boys excelled.
All three of my sons played ice hockey, so I knew them through high school boys ice hockey. And they were always present, always supportive. Kyle was the hero of the team. He was the only goaltender. In fact, when I first met Jeff, it was down, standing as goaltender fathers do, at the end of the ice.
After high school, the Navin's youngest son attended college in Mississippi and pursued a career in golf. Kyle stayed in Connecticut and joined his parents' trash pickup business.
Their business essentially consisted of a two-truck operation, one operated by Jeff and one by their son, Kyle.
The Navin's success eventually allowed Jeffrey and Jeanette to purchase a $1.3 million, 8,000-square-foot mansion in Fairfield County. The couple also bought their son Kyle his own house in the nearby town of Bridgeport, where he lived with his girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente.
Jennifer's family came from Westport as well, and they were longtime residents there.
After Kyle and Jennifer graduated, the high school sweethearts began to build a life together in their new home.
They had two Rottweilers, and they loved the dogs. And they would drive around together with the dogs in the garbage truck. They were happy.
In the spring of 2015, with both sons grown and settled, Jeffrey and Jeanette began planning for their own future.
They had sold their house. They rented the smaller house in Easton, I think with the anticipation of retiring, within a year or two's time.
But on the morning of August 7th, 2015, the Navin's plan for the future would come to an abrupt halt when Easton police receive an ominous report from Jeffrey Navin's sister, Laura Thompson.
Laura Thompson comes into the Easton Police Department to file a report that she has not heard or seen from her brother, Jeffrey, or her sister-in-law, Jeanette Navin, for 3 days.
Jeffrey runs a refuse company, and when the garbage is not collected on a regular basis, the customers aren't happy, and they voice their concerns.
What was told to me by Laura was that he never missed a route, and if they were to go on vacation or go away in some manner, that either his son Kyle would cover the route, or he'd find another person or another way to cover that route.
Jeffrey's sister tells police that Kyle was the last person to see his parents 3 days earlier.
They had been calling Jeffrey and Jeanette's phones, and they were finding that their phones were turned off. When you find a phone that's off consistently for a period of days, inexplicably, that's another red flag.
That afternoon, Easton police dispatch an officer to the Navin's house for a wellness check.
I just wanted to do a well check on the house just to make sure they weren't inside and were injured. When I went in, I entered the kitchen. I observed that there was a couple of dishes in the sink, nothing messy. The house was kept well, nothing out of place. There was a to-do list on the refrigerator. There was unplug a couple things, make sure to unplug the dehumidifier, turn off the lights, things of that nature.
Initially, we were thinking that this may be a vacation list. If you're going on vacation, these are the things you want to do before you go on vacation.
On one of the day planners that they had circled a bunch of dates for baseball games that they wanted to go to, one of being in Detroit. And one of the dates was during the time that we were looking at them.
Maybe they went away, they forgot to tell someone to run the routes.
When I went upstairs, I noticed that the house continued to be clean. There was nothing to indicate that there was a struggle or anything nefarious that had happened.
Outside, police note that one of the Navin's personal vehicles is missing.
From what Laura Thompson had said, that there was another vehicle that was not in the driveway at the time.
Jeanette Navin's Dodge pickup truck was not at the residence.
We put out information on the two people that were missing, as well as the color, the VIN number, plate number on that car to surrounding counties.
Investigators next reach out to Jeffrey and Jeanette's 27-year-old son, Kyle Navin. Kyle tells police that the last time he spoke with his parents was the night before they disappeared.
Kyle Navin indicated to Detective Lyman that his parents had come by his residence on Aldine Avenue in Bridgeport on Tuesday, the 4th of August.
They visited him at home and asked him to go to dinner that night. He said no, his back was hurting too much, and he told me that they had told him they were thinking of going to New York City to have dinner that night. He also said that's not unusual, that they often go away for short periods of time.
With no other leads to chase, investigators contact the couple's cell phone provider.
We did what's called an ex parte search warrant for their cell phone, which just gives us basic subscriber information and what the status of their phones are and when the last time it was used.
The phones were turned off, we discovered, which was disturbing.
Both of them went off the grid, off the network, on the 4th of August. Jeanette's was early in the morning at 9:20, and Jeffrey's was at 1:23 in the afternoon.
I don't know anybody that owns a business that turns their phone off for 3 or 4 days, doesn't check in. Highly unusual for them in particular, and really in our current society for anybody to turn their phone off for 3 to 4 days.
Coming up, as police search for the missing couple, new evidence suggests a possible motive.
There was a big chunk of money there. We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette.
And a witness comes forward with a disturbing story.
He was out of sorts. He was yelling. They never saw him so angry. And then he says, "You're setting me up."
Police in Easton, Connecticut are searching for local business owners Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin, who seemingly disappeared on August 4th, 2015.
If you're running a family business of that scale, you don't just disappear. That just can't happen. And so I thought it could be something else, that it could be a serious illness in the family. If they had heard of somebody in need, they would have dropped everything and gone, which would have been characteristic of Jeff and Jeanette. And that was kind of like, it must be something like that.
But 72 hours after the couple was reported missing, a Connecticut state trooper makes an ominous discovery.
Trooper John Ring, during a patrol check of the Exit 42 commuter lot in Westport, located Jeanette's Dodge pickup truck parked in the lot. The vehicle had sustained a broken window and was vandalized. We conducted a canvass of the area, and during the canvass of the area, there was an abandoned house across the street from the commuter lot in which we found J&J business cards.
Police recognized the name on the card as the Navin's company.
We did execute a search warrant of that abandoned property, and we found indicators that some of the items from that truck had been brought over to that house and had been just essentially discarded there.
But where are Jeanette and Jeffrey Navin now?
The last contact that anybody had was on the 4th with Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin. If there was foul play in play here, there was a 3 to 4 day head start.
As time ticks on, the danger increases of them losing their lives.
That's when we notified the press. What we're trying to do is follow everything up and see where they were prior to leaving. And that's a lot of legwork.
People that you knew were all of a sudden, on television, and something bad was going on. It's surreal. Everything was abuzz, and friends and people in the community were calling each other right away.
They are not the type of people who would vanish in thin air, who would just take off.
That's when we started getting a lot more information from people who were friendly with the Navins.
On August 10th, investigators get a promising new lead when the weighmaster of a Westport trash facility comes forward with new information.
The Navins were operating using smaller garbage trucks, and they would routinely go to the Westport transfer station, which is right off exit 18 in Westport.
The operator recalls seeing Jeffrey there on August 4th.
He stated to me that he did see Mr. Jeffrey Navin pull in. He noted at the time when he pulled in, he was on his cell phone. He appeared agitated and he was yelling on his phone at the time.
He was out of sorts. He was yelling, and it was something they'd never seen before. That they never saw him so angry or so irate.
Investigators wonder if Jeffrey's call could be related to trouble with the Navin's business. To find out, they subpoena the Navin's bank records.
Was there financial difficulties? What is the reason for their disappearance? Did they make a large withdrawal? Are they in debt? We discovered that they were going to sell their business. They had just sold a house in Weston, downsized for the purposes of getting their finances in order and selling the business, preparing to retire.
There was a big chunk of money there. And then you wonder if one of the two of them did something and left. We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette and take the money and run.
On August 12, 2015, authorities in Easton, Connecticut are searching for Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin when they learn the couple was sitting on a sizable nest egg.
But they had just sold a house in Weston, so it didn't sound like they were in any great financial stress.
We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette and take the money and run.
But that theory is quickly dispelled.
I did a search warrant which determined there was no money being withdrawn or deposited.
As the following days went on, there was no activity on any bank accounts or credit cards.
Family members insist that financial issues were not a factor in the couple's disappearance. In fact, they were both looking forward to retirement. But as investigators continue to speak with friends and associates, they notice a common theme. The Navins were determined to sell their business instead of leaving it to their son, Kyle.
We talked to two good friends of Jeanette Navin, and they were both consistent with saying that they were having an issue with Kyle.
Jeanette Navin had indicated to some of her friends that she believed he was using drugs.
During his hockey career, he sustained a legitimate back injury. And as a result of that back injury, he was prescribed at some point OxyContin for painkilling purposes. And unfortunately, he went down a road which many people in the United States find themselves in, where pain medication leads to abuse of pain medication, which leads to abuse of other drugs.
He had this drug issue that his parents did not want to support, and he had a girlfriend that his parents apparently did not approve of.
Kyle had a drug addiction. This drug addiction was in some degree managed by Jennifer, who would give him pain medications.
According to friends, Jeffrey and Jeanette worried for their oldest son, who had become increasingly irresponsible.
Kyle was taking time off, missing the route, and then his mother would have to do the route. The father was a hardworking man who took his job very seriously, and I think that's where the frustrations came with his son.
They bought him a house, trying to get him set up on his own. You know, how many parents buy their child a house?
They're trying to help him, but it's that line between helping and enabling is so fine.
Friends tell police that eventually Jeffrey and Jeanette took a tougher approach to dealing with Kyle.
They felt enough was enough. They were going to retire in a year. They were going to kind of sell the business, and at that point, Kyle was on his own.
Investigators theorize that if Kyle knew his parents were going to cut him off, he might have been involved in their disappearance.
Chief Shaw and myself called Kyle and asked him to come in for an interview because we wanted to ask him some further questions.
Let's go over this one more time, make sure you didn't miss something.
When Kyle sits down with investigators, he quickly volunteers new details about the day his parents disappeared.
One of the important things that came out of this interview was that Kyle accounted for the presence of his mother's Dodge truck in the 42 commuter lot. His claim was that he had met his mother in the commuter lot on the 4th of August.
He was having difficulties with his back pain, so he called his mother, and they met at the commuter lot where her truck was later found, and him and his mother went out on his route. He was driving the truck, his mother was throwing the garbage in the back of the garbage truck. After some period of time, he claimed that he called his father and he wanted to go home.
He alleged that he dropped his mother off to his father sometime around 10:30.
As Kyle continues talking, investigators make note of a discrepancy in his new statement.
In an initial statement, he told the police his parents had stopped by his house that day. Later on, in a different statement, he said his parents had not stopped by his house that day.
Now, we know he's lying. Because if you're telling the truth is the truth. There may be little variances, but these were completely different recollection of the events.
Investigators release Kyle but continue collecting evidence against him. They start by obtaining a report from his cell phone company that reveals the whereabouts of his phone in the hours before his parents disappeared. Detectives compare the report with similar records for Jeffrey and Jeanette's phones.
We could tell with great precision where Jeanette's phone was and what the last real cell phone contact was. That was early in the morning on the day that she and Jeff disappeared.
The last tower that Jeanette's phone interacted with was the tower closest to Kyle's house in Bridgeport. Kyle's phone was also interacting with the tower closest to his house.
Jeffrey Navin's phone the last activity on that phone hit off its closest cell tower to Kyle Navin's house in Bridgeport. We see that Jeffrey Navin's phone is there and Kyle Navin's phone is there. We know they're together. It shows that Jeffrey and Kyle were in the same vicinity.
Police used the evidence to get a full subpoena for Jeffrey and Jeanette's phone records, and they reveal that Jeffrey had a heated text conversation with his son on the last morning he was seen alive.
Mid-morning of August 4th, Jeff Navin was in a heated phone conversation, screaming into his phone. At the Westport transfer station, evidence through both his cell phone records and Kyle's cell phone records indicate that that was a phone conversation with Kyle.
When investigators dig deeper into Jeffrey's messages, they uncover an alarming exchange between Jeffrey and Kyle on August 4th.
About 12:30, Jeff sent a message to Kyle, "Did you hurt Mom?" So clearly something had transpired between them, either in the oral conversation on the phone or in the text messages that we didn't have, that made Jeff think that Kyle had done something to Jeanette.
And then Jeffrey says, "You're setting me up."
Jeffrey would say, "I'm not coming home if you're trying to frame me for murder." Kyle again would say, "I don't know what you're talking about."
That did make sense on why the father would say that to his son, unless he had knowledge of something in the past that maybe his son said to him face to face.
At 1:14 p.m., Kyle Navin texted his father that he would be waiting for him at his house in Bridgeport.
And it went into, "All right, having a problem with my phone. I left you a spot on the street for you to park." I believe it was a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon was the last text from Dad.
When you read the text message, one of them says, "I'm going to call the police." And I think collectively everybody who was part of this investigation wishes he didn't.
Coming up, police focus their efforts on a second person of interest.
I don't think you've been 100% truthful with us.
I'm being truthful, but it's hard for me to be accurate.
And a harrowing discovery sends shockwaves through the community.
When he went to scoop up a pile of leaves, he saw bones.
One week after the disappearance of Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin, investigators have zeroed in on the couple's son, Kyle Navin, as their primary suspect. On August 12, 2015, Connecticut state troopers conduct a third interview with the 27-year-old.
There's a couple variations in your story that kind of, concern me in a way. I want to just clarify it all. Yeah.
Investigators focus on a series of text messages Kyle exchanged with his father on August 4th.
Kyle, you remember that question that your dad asked on the text?
What? Which question?
The one that...
Did you hurt Mom? Do you remember that?
No, I don't really remember.
It was our feeling that he was lying. So, let's get the latest set of lies out. It's being audio and video recorded. And then we can start picking apart this set of lies. Detective Allegro and I asked him point blank, "Did you kill your parents?"
Did you have anything to do with it? No. Did you hurt your parents?
No.
Did you kill your mother?
No.
Did you kill your father?
No. Say they're no longer alive. I think that person should be punished.
As their interview with Kyle intensifies, detectives notice a shift in his demeanor.
One of the things that was noteworthy was the body language. He was very just non-animated, monotone, one-word answers. Why was there such a lack of concern that my parents are missing? There was nothing, no emotion, which is unusual.
Unfortunately, without any evidence of foul play, police are unable to charge Kyle or keep him in custody.
Prior to Kyle leaving the Troop G barracks that evening, investigators advised him that we were seizing 2 items that he came to the troop with. We seized his cell phone, and we seized the vehicle that he drove himself to Troop G in the dump truck.
A forensic analysis of Kyle's phone reveals several deleted text messages between Kyle and his girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente, in the weeks before Jeffrey and Jeanette's disappearance.
On around July 8th of 2015, there's a text chain between Kyle and Jennifer in which Kyle is talking about the money his parents have in a credit union. He's talking about how he and Jennifer can get that money and then take luxury vacations, remodel their house, remodel the garbage truck, and have this idyllic, fantastic life together.
Kyle alludes to the fact that if his parents went away, which he put in quotes in the text message, that their lives would be so much better. Well, we all know what that is indicative of.
The new evidence prompts investigators to question Jennifer Valiente's knowledge of the disappearances.
The words she used seemed to be pushing Kyle to do something, to almost challenge him, I felt. And she says to him, "You're getting played by his parents."
Investigators also conduct a forensic search of Kyle Navin's garbage truck.
They were able to locate what appeared to be 2 possible bullet holes through the passenger seat. That's a game changer. Once there was evidence of possible gunshots in the truck, they wanted to go back to Kyle's home in Bridgeport and do a more extensive search.
On August 18th, 11 days after the Navins were first reported missing, investigators execute a search warrant for Kyle Navin and Jennifer Valiente's Bridgeport home.
When we entered that home, we weren't sure what we were going to locate there, as far as could we find the thread of hope that someone's alive or find the body.
We located a Sig Sauer 40 caliber handgun and a Smith & Wesson 380 handgun, both of which were registered to Kyle. Another item that was located and seized was a Home Depot receipt.
The Home Depot receipt listed items that would be consistent with someone trying to cover up crime. Bleach, cleaners, contractor bags, blue painter's tape.
The receipt is dated Wednesday, August 5th, the day after Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin disappeared.
We basically went through the entire house, and we found some carpet missing in the basement.
It appeared to have been freshly cut out near the base of the stairwell. Various areas were sprayed with luminol, including the carpet area, and there was a positive reaction for human blood.
Investigators send the blood samples to the lab for DNA testing.
Detectives also noticed there appeared to be defects in the wall, which appeared consistent with striking of a concrete wall by projectiles. So as if someone coming down the stairs was fired upon from the basement.
Based on phone records, investigators speculate that Jeffrey Navin was headed to Kyle's house around 1 p.m. on August 4th.
But 1:23 p.m. on the 4th of August 2015, Jeffrey Navin's cell phone makes its last contact with the network. It's on a tower which services Kyle Navin's house. We believe that Jeffrey entered the house and was lured into the basement and was killed in the basement.
But if Jeffrey Navin was murdered in Kyle's basement, who had returned his truck to Jeffrey and Jeanette's house in Easton? Investigators believe they know how to find out.
I was aware of a surveillance camera at a residence on one of our main roads in town, which happens to lead to the area of where Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin lived.
I went down, spoke with the gentleman who lived at the address, and he gave me consent to take the entire hard drive. And I was able to go back to the department, sift through minute by minute.
When investigators check the footage from August 4th, they spot Jeffrey Navin's truck pass at 3:06 p.m.
We saw the truck, and then we saw a small Honda behind it.
DMV records indicate that Jennifer Valiente owns a Honda identical to the vehicle following the garbage truck in the surveillance video.
And very quickly, we realized that that was the girlfriend following the truck. And then moments later, the Honda is driven back down Center Road towards Bridgeport without the truck. It appeared very common sense that Kyle drove the father's truck to the house in Easton, and then the girlfriend drove Kyle back to Bridgeport.
On August 21st, 2015, investigators bring Jennifer Valiente in for questioning and confront her with their findings.
One of the aspects that they addressed in this interview was surveillance footage from Center Road in Easton.
Now, the black Honda, that's your car, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You're the only one that drives it?
I drive it, yeah.
And the reason that they had brought the vehicle up to leave it up at Jeffrey's house was supposedly that there had been a mechanical issue. Then the obvious follow-up question to that is, where's Jeffrey Navin during this time? She had no real response to that.
So that means Dad is at the Bridgeport house?
His father was on sale Sunday.
So the truck mysteriously appeared there?
I don't know how it got there. I don't know if Kyle brought it home. I don't know if it... I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Investigators also asked Jennifer about the items she and Kyle purchased at Home Depot.
Do you remember, what would you need bleach for?
I don't know. I don't remember buying bleach.
Whenever she got to a difficult point in the conversation or a difficult question or was challenged, her response was always, I don't know, or I don't remember.
I don't think you've been 100% truthful with us, Sam.
I'm being truthful, but it's hard for me to be accurate. I'm trying to be accurate. It's not, like I said, if it happened yesterday or last week, I would know. Not even last week. But if it, you know what I mean? If it happened in the past few days.
Despite investigators' best efforts, Jennifer refuses to implicate herself or Kyle in Jeffrey and Jeanette's disappearance.
That time of limbo was very difficult. Law enforcement wanted to see the arrest, but we also understand from the prosecutor's standpoint, he doesn't want to make an arrest unless he feels he can bring it to a successful conclusion. And we had basically exhausted the investigation, where the only thing we needed was to find the bodies.
Nearly 3 months pass. Then, on October 29th, 2015, the case takes a grim turn when police receive a phone call about a discovery behind an unoccupied house.
The owner of the house went up there to move some leaves, some debris around, and when he went to scoop up a pile of leaves, he saw a tarp. And when he got out to look at it, he saw bones.
Their discovery led them to step away and call the police. Weston police showed up. They noticed that right away that there was 2 bodies.
One body was found loosely wrapped in a tarp. The other is found tightly wrapped in contractor bags.
Autopsies confirm the remains belong to Jeanette and Jeffrey Navin.
The medical examiner's office was able to certify that both deaths were homicides and that the manner of death was gunshot wound.
In addition, a .40 caliber bullet was recovered from the remains.
Kyle Navin owned a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The projectiles recovered from the bodies of his parents were the same caliber. That's enough for us to arrest Jennifer Valiente and Kyle Navin for the murder of his mother and the murder of his father in separate counts.
In Fairfield County, Connecticut, authorities have arrested Kyle Navin and Jennifer Valiente for the murders of Kyle's parents, Jeanette and Jeffrey Navin.
There were so many horrible truths that landed in one moment. The horrible truth that all the different things that people had hoped and speculated about where Jeff and Jeanette may have gone or what they might be doing, gone.
I think the whole community talked about it for months because we just could not believe it happened in our town.
Forensic analysts linked Jeanette Navin's DNA to blood samples found in Kyle Navin's truck. They also find traces of Jeanette's DNA on the .40 caliber gun retrieved from Kyle's house.
Jeanette Navin's blood was found on the muzzle of that pistol, which is a strong inference that that was indeed the murder weapon.
What we believe happened was sometime after 8:45, Kyle Navin was in the vehicle with his mother, shot her twice as she sat in his truck.
2 shots right in her chest.
She, in all likelihood, died in the truck next to her son as she was trying to help him work his job. He then drove up to the Staples Road address where his parents were renting their home in Easton.
Based on text recovered from Kyle's phone, police believe that after shooting his mother, he moved on to the next stage of his plan, luring his father back to his home.
He gets his father to meet him at his house on Baldine Street in Bridgeport, and when the father comes in the house, he somehow gets him into the basement.
DNA evidence recovered from the carpet confirms Kyle had been waiting in the basement for his father with deadly intent.
Careful examination of the wall going up the stairs from that basement found a small quantity of Jeff Navin's blood. The inference from this is that Kyle Navin was in the basement. Jeff Navin came down there and he shot him.
After moving his father's truck, investigators theorize that Kyle's girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente, drove him home, where they cleaned up the scene and later disposed of the bodies.
When Kyle Navin disposed of the bodies of his murdered parents, they weren't in the ground, they weren't buried in a shallow grave. They were dumped in a pile of leaves. To him, it seemed that was sufficient. And he went back home to Bridgeport and got on with his life.
Our theory of the case was that Kyle had a deteriorating relationship with his parents over the summer of 2015. And in an effort to gain access to their money, he killed his parents.
I think that Kyle almost felt the victim. His parents were ruining his life by taking away his livelihood. He was thinking, just kill my parents and everything will be great.
With the evidence stacked against her, attorneys for Jennifer Valiente reach a plea deal with prosecutors in November of 2017.
Jennifer pled under the Alford Doctrine of conspiracy to commit murder, so she didn't admit she participated in the conspiracy, but conceded she could have been convicted, so she never admitted it.
Ultimately, Jennifer Valiente received a sentence of 15 years in the state's prison.
Kyle Navin fights the charges against him, filing repeated motions to suppress evidence. But on April 16, 2018, one day before his trial is set to begin, he agrees to plead guilty to 2 counts of murder.
The judge had a very impactful statement asking Kyle if he killed his parents, and he said yes.
He received 55 years on each count to run concurrent. In Connecticut, there is no parole for murder, and essentially you do day for day.
Kyle's guilty plea brings a measure of relief to many in the community, but it also leaves those who knew him before the crime in disbelief.
Kyle did horrible things for which he is rightly being held accountable. But there were no signs of that, which is what made this so much more upsetting at the time and confusing and hard.
When we prosecute people for crimes, we have to remember that they're human beings. Human beings are motivated by emotion, they're motivated by greed, they're motivated by love.
There was a conspiracy between those two to get rid of the parents so they could live happily ever after. We're going to get all this money, you know, we're going to live happily ever after. Totally self-centered, 2 selfish individuals.
Part of the shock of this is in the compassionate character of the family. The Navins were the type of people, they would do anything for other people, for people that so consistently demonstrated such depth of goodness. To have this happen to them all these years later, this still does not seem real. It's completely surreal.
There was a human skull inside an old tire. That was the first thing the man saw. It was September 10, 1990, near Manville, Texas, on a quiet stretch of County Road 101 that looked nothing like the growing communities surrounding it today. Back then, the road was isolated, rough, nearly forgotten. There were few houses, few businesses, little reason for anyone to stop there. But that afternoon, someone did. A man driving through the area pulled over near a barricade. He had stopped for an ordinary reason. Nothing about the moment suggested that he was about to uncover one of Brazoria County's most haunting mysteries. Then he noticed the tire. Inside it was something that did not belong there. A human skull. He went home. He told his wife. And police were called. When investigators arrived, the discovery became even more disturbing. Scattered around the area were human bones. There was no purse, no identification, no clothing that could immediately tell investigators who she was, no driver's license, no photograph, no obvious clue pointing to a family waiting somewhere for her return. Only bones and jewelry. Investigators eventually recovered roughly 60% of the woman's skeleton, but the absence of the usual belongings made the scene almost impossible to understand. Who was she? Why was she there? How long had she been lying beside that lonely road? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, who had left her there? At the time, investigators could not answer any of them. The remains were taken for examination. The woman was believed to have been young. Very young. Initial estimates placed her somewhere between 15 and 19 years old. She was described as approximately 5 feet tall. The medical examination revealed fractures to 2 ribs. There was also an unusual finding involving a tooth that had been surgically removed, along with a lesion or tumor associated with the area beneath one knee. But the examination could not provide the answer investigators desperately needed. How had she died? There was no clear answer. No obvious fatal injury. No definitive weapon. No reliable timeline that could reconstruct her final hours. The medical examiner could not establish the manner of death with certainty. And without a name, even the most basic investigation became a maze. There was nobody to interview. Nobody who could say, "That's my daughter." Nobody who could say, "She was supposed to come home that night." Nobody who could explain where she had been living, who she had been seeing, or why she had disappeared. The woman became another unidentified victim. Another Jane Doe. Another case number. Another photograph placed inside a file that might otherwise disappear into an evidence room. But there was something else. Jewelry. Several pieces had been found with the remains. A pearl bracelet. A silver ring. A gold ring decorated with clear stones. Another ring featuring a turquoise horse or unicorn design. And then investigators found the object that would eventually give the unknown woman a name. A class ring. It belonged to Robert E. Lee High School in Houston. The year engraved on it was 1975. And in the center was a striking blue stone. That blue stone would become the most recognizable clue in the entire investigation. It would also inspire the name that would follow the unidentified woman for decades. Princess Blue. The name was never hers. Nobody knew what her real name was. Nobody knew what her family called her. But investigators and later members of the public needed something to call the woman whose identity had vanished. Princess Blue. A name created from a piece of jewelry. A name that sounded almost beautiful. But behind it was a brutal reality. Someone had died. And nobody knew who she was. The 1975 class ring immediately raised questions. The victim appeared far too young to have graduated from Robert E. Lee High School in 1975. If she really had been 15 to 19 when she died, she would have been only a small child when that class graduated. So the ring probably belonged to somebody else. A mother. A relative. A friend. An older companion. Or perhaps someone who had simply given it to her. But every possibility created another question. How had the ring traveled from a high school graduating class in Houston to the remains of an unidentified young woman on a deserted road outside Manville? Investigators had almost nothing to work with. The ring itself had been altered. Its original size had been approximately 7.5. It had later been enlarged to about 9.5. That alteration mattered. Because whatever identifying markings may once have existed inside the band could have been damaged or erased. The manufacturer no longer had the records investigators wanted. The 1975 graduating class had hundreds of students. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of families. Hundreds of possible stories. And investigators had no certainty that the ring had even belonged to a member of that graduating class. Still, it was the strongest lead they had. So they followed it. But the investigation moved slowly. Years passed. The world changed. Technology changed. Manville changed. The lonely road where the remains were discovered eventually became part of a far more developed landscape. But the woman remained unidentified. For years the case sat quietly. The bones waited. The jewelry waited. The blue ring waited. And somewhere in Texas, a family may have continued wondering what happened to a daughter, sister, or relative who had disappeared without explanation. That is what made the case so haunting. The police knew a woman had died. They knew where her remains had been found. They knew she had been carrying jewelry. They knew she had worn a bluestone class ring connected to a Houston high school. But they did not know her name. And without her name, every other question became harder. Where had she lived? Where had she gone? Who had last seen her alive? Who had been with her? Was she reported missing? Had someone deliberately hidden her identity? Had her belongings been removed before her body was abandoned? Was the remote location chosen because the killer believed nobody would find her? Or was the location simply where her remains had eventually come to rest? There were possibilities, but no answers. Then, 16 years after the discovery, something happened that changed the direction of the investigation. A detective took another look. Not at some revolutionary new technology. Not at a secret confession. Not at a mysterious phone call. At the evidence that had been sitting there all along. The jewelry. The ring. The blue stone. A clue that had been documented decades earlier suddenly became the center of renewed attention. Investigators began tracing the ring back to Robert E. Lee High School. They discovered the year 1975. They learned more about the graduating class. They began trying to identify women who might have owned such a ring. And suddenly, Princess Blue was no longer simply an unidentified body. She had a connection. A school. A year. A city. A blue stone. A trail. It was still an extraordinarily thin trail. But after 16 years of silence, even a thin trail was something. The investigators needed people who remembered. They needed former students. They needed classmates. They needed anyone who might recognize the ring. Anyone who might remember a girl who had disappeared. Anyone who might know how a 1975 class ring had ended up with an unidentified young woman 15 years later. And the search expanded. Former students were contacted. Information about the ring was distributed. The case began attracting attention beyond local law enforcement. Online investigators became interested. People who had never met Princess Blue began searching missing person databases. They compared photographs. They studied old yearbooks. They searched names. They looked for women who had disappeared around the same period. They asked questions investigators had been unable to answer. Could this be her? Could that missing girl have been Princess Blue? Could the ring belong to a relative? Could the victim have been connected to Houston? Could someone have known exactly who she was and simply never told police? The mystery began to grow. And for the first time, Princess Blue had something that every unidentified victim needs. People looking for her. But the search was about to become even stranger. Because the woman investigators thought they were searching for did not necessarily match the person she had actually been. The original estimates of her age and ancestry would later be questioned. Forensic reconstruction would produce different possibilities. And the ring that had seemed like the key to her identity might not have belonged to her at all. It may have belonged to someone else. Someone whose own story had become connected to hers by a chain of circumstances that nobody could fully reconstruct. For years, Princess Blue existed between two worlds. In one world, she was evidence. Bones. Jewelry. A case number. In the other, she was a missing person. A daughter. A sister. A young woman whose life had existed before the road, before the skeleton, before the blue stone became her only name. But those two worlds had not yet been connected. Not until technology caught up with a mystery that had survived for decades. DNA would eventually accomplish what interviews, sketches, jewelry, databases, and old school records could not. It would give Princess Blue something she had been denied since the day her remains were discovered. A real name. Julie Gwen Davis. The name would emerge nearly 30 years after the remains were found. And when investigators finally announced the identification, the mystery changed. Princess Blue was no longer a Jane Doe. She was Julie. A real woman. A real daughter. A real sister. A person who had once laughed, spoken, made plans, and walked through the world under a name that had nothing to do with the blue ring found beside her remains. Her family had been searching for answers. And suddenly, one of the most painful questions had finally been answered. Who was she? Julie Gwen Davis. But the identification did not end the mystery. It opened another door. Because knowing who the victim was does not automatically reveal who killed her. It does not explain where she spent her final days. It does not explain why her remains were found in Manville. It does not explain the fractures. It does not explain the absence of her belongings. It does not explain the long period between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains. And it does not explain what happened to Julie before she became Princess Blue. The blue ring had finally led investigators to her name. But it had not led them to the person responsible for her death. And somewhere inside that gap between identity and justice is the part of the story that remains unanswered. Because after almost 30 years, investigators had finally learned who Princess Blue really was. The question that remained was far more difficult. Who had made sure she could not tell them what happened? For nearly 3 decades, the woman had no name. There was only a skeleton, a handful of pieces of jewelry, a blue stone, and a question that refused to disappear. Who was she? The answer would eventually come from a man who was not originally searching for Princess Blue at all. His name was Danny Davis. He was searching for his missing sister. Julie Gwen Davis had disappeared years earlier, after moving from Orange, Texas, to New Orleans, Louisiana. She had vanished from her family's life, leaving behind questions that had never been answered. Her family did not know where she had gone. They did not know whether she was alive. And for years, they had no idea that her remains might already be sitting inside a law enforcement evidence system hundreds of miles away. That is the cruel mathematics of a cold case. One family searches for a missing person. Another agency stores unidentified remains. Both are looking for the same woman. But neither knows it. For years, the two investigations moved separately. One was a missing person case. The other was an unidentified decedent case. The connection between them existed somewhere inside DNA. But in the early 1990s, that connection was beyond the reach of investigators. When Princess Blue was discovered in Manville on September 10, 1990, forensic DNA identification was not the tool it would later become. Investigators had to rely on what they could see, what they could measure, what they could recover, and what the bones could tell them. The remains were badly decomposed. By the time they were discovered, investigators were dealing primarily with a skeleton. The woman had been dead for months. There was no face to photograph. No fingerprints. No wallet. No driver's license. No family member waiting at the scene to identify her. Only fragments of a life. The jewelry became crucial. A pearl bracelet. Several rings. And that distinctive high school class ring. Robert E. Lee High School. 1975. A bright blue stone. The object seemed almost impossibly specific. Investigators hoped it would solve everything. Instead, it created another mystery. The woman was initially believed to be between 15 and 19 years old. But a 1975 high school class ring did not make immediate sense. If the victim had really been a teenager in 1990, she would have been only a small child when that class graduated. So the ring probably did not belong to her as a graduate. Perhaps someone had given it to her. Perhaps it belonged to a relative. Perhaps it had been passed from one person to another. Or perhaps it had been picked up somewhere and later worn by the victim. Every explanation was possible. None could be proven. Police began searching for the original owner. They contacted former students. They looked into the school. They tried to determine whether anyone remembered the ring. But nobody came forward with the answer investigators needed. The blue stone remained silent. The case remained silent. And the unknown woman remained Princess Blue. 16 years passed before Detective Sergeant Anthony Michel of the Manville Police Department took another look at the old case. The evidence had been sitting there. The jewelry had been documented. But the details had not produced a breakthrough. Michel went back through the case file. He looked at the photographs. He examined the jewelry. And he focused on the class ring. The ring carried information. A school. A year. A physical object that could potentially be traced. That was enough to reopen the trail. Investigators began contacting alumni from Robert E. Lee High School. They hoped someone would recognize the ring. Someone might remember who had owned it. Someone might remember a student who had lost it. Someone might remember giving it away. But once again the trail seemed to disappear. The ring did not lead directly to Princess Blue. It led to uncertainty. The case was still trapped between two identities. The woman investigators believed they were searching for, and the woman who had actually disappeared might not have been the same person they imagined. The original forensic estimates had been made from skeletal remains. They were not photographs. They were not birth certificates. They were estimates. And estimates can change. That mattered because Julie Davis had disappeared years earlier. Her family had been living with uncertainty. She had been missing since the 1980s. There was no body. No confirmed sighting. No definitive explanation. Just another unresolved disappearance. And somewhere in Texas, a woman who had been unidentified for decades was waiting for the right comparison. Then technology changed the investigation. DNA could now do what the class ring could not. It could connect a dead woman to a living family. It could cross the distance between Manville and Orange. It could bridge decades. In 2019, the case received renewed public attention. ABC 13 featured Princess Blue in its 13 Unsolved series. The story reached viewers who had never heard of the unidentified woman. The images of the jewelry were shown. The blue ring became visible again. The case was no longer buried inside an old police file. It was back in the public eye. At almost exactly the same time, about 130 miles east of Manville, another investigation was unfolding. Danny Davis had submitted his DNA to a Texas Ranger. He was hoping the sample could help locate his sister Julie. He was not necessarily thinking about Princess Blue. He was thinking about Julie. A woman who had vanished. A family member whose absence had lasted years. A name that still meant something to someone. The DNA entered a state database. Then came the match. Princess Blue. The unidentified remains from Manville. Julie Gwen Davis. The connection was almost unbelievable. A woman who had been without a name for almost 30 years suddenly had one. And a family that had spent decades wondering what had happened to Julie suddenly had an answer to the question of identity. Investigators reported a 99.9% certainty that Princess Blue was Julie Davis. The blue stone had not solved the case. The class ring had not solved the case. A photograph had not solved the case. A witness had not solved the case. DNA had. But the identification carried a painful realization. Julie had not simply disappeared. She had died. Her family had been living with uncertainty, while her remains were already in Texas. For almost 30 years, they had been separated from the truth by a wall of missing information. And now that wall had finally collapsed. But the collapse exposed something even darker. The identity was solved. The death was not. Investigators still could not establish exactly how Julie died. The original medical examination had not determined the cause or manner of death. There were fractures to 2 ribs. There were other skeletal findings. But nothing provided a definitive explanation. There was no confirmed murder weapon. No confession. No eyewitness. No clear timeline. No known person publicly identified as responsible. The case had crossed one enormous boundary. It was no longer an unidentified person case, but it remained a death investigation. And perhaps a homicide investigation. Julie had been found alone. Her belongings were limited. Her body had been left in an isolated area. And by the time anyone found her, the physical evidence had been reduced to bones. That meant the investigation had lost one of the most valuable things detectives normally have: time. A fresh crime scene can speak. A skeleton often whispers. Weather destroys evidence. Animals scatter remains. Water moves objects. Years erase memories. People die. Witnesses forget. Buildings disappear. Roads change. And places that once looked isolated can become completely unrecognizable. The road where Julie's remains were found was eventually transformed. What had once been a sparsely populated area became surrounded by development. Traffic increased. Businesses appeared. Buildings replaced empty stretches of land. The landscape itself became another reminder of how much time had passed. Imagine investigators returning decades later. The road is still there. But the world around it has changed. The location that once concealed a secret is now surrounded by ordinary life. People drive past. Children go to school. Families shop. Workers open businesses. Few of them know that beneath the history of that place is the memory of a young woman whose life ended there. Julie Davis. Princess Blue. For years, people had known her only by a name created from a piece of jewelry. Now her real name had returned. Her family could finally say it. Julie. Not Jane Doe. Not unidentified female. Not Princess Blue. Julie Gwen Davis. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. Because identification is not justice. Finding a victim's name is not the same as finding the person responsible. And that distinction is where the case becomes truly haunting. The DNA match answered the question detectives had been asking for decades. But it also created new questions. What happened to Julie after she disappeared? Where had she been living? Who had she been with? How did she travel from Louisiana back toward Texas? Why was she found in Manville? Who knew she was there? Who had last seen her alive? And perhaps most importantly, was someone responsible for her death? Her brother believed she had been murdered. Authorities reopened the investigation following the identification. But a reopened case does not guarantee an immediate answer. Investigators still have to rebuild a life that disappeared decades ago. They have to reconstruct movements, relationships, locations, associates, telephone records that may no longer exist, addresses that may have changed, people who may have moved away, people who may have died, memories that have faded, evidence that may have disappeared forever. The name Julie Davis gave investigators something Princess Blue never could. A history. A family. A past. But history can also reveal how much remains missing. Because Julie was not born in Manville. She was not simply a nameless woman who appeared beside a Texas road. She had a life before the skeleton. She had family. She had childhood memories. She had a face. She had a voice. She had plans. And somewhere in those missing years may be the answer to the final mystery. The blue ring once represented the only identity investigators could give her. Now it represents something else. A reminder. A clue that survived when almost everything else disappeared. For decades, the ring told investigators that someone had once owned it. The DNA eventually told them who owned the life attached to the mystery: Julie Gwen Davis. But the person who could explain what happened to Julie never stepped forward. And that leaves the case suspended in a terrible space between discovery and justice. The woman finally has her name. Her family finally has her remains. The community finally knows who Princess Blue was. But somewhere inside the decades of silence is the story nobody has been able to reconstruct. A young woman disappeared. Her family waited. A skeleton was found. Investigators searched. A blue stone became a symbol. Years became decades. Then DNA brought Julie home. Yet one question still remains. When Julie Davis disappeared, what happened during the final hours of her life? Because the mystery was never really about the blue ring. It was about the woman wearing it. And now that investigators finally know her name, there is nowhere left for that final secret to hide except in the silence of the people who may have known her last. The most important clue in the case had been sitting inside a box for years. It was not hidden underground. It was not buried beneath a wall. It was not locked inside a safe. It was simply evidence. A collection of jewelry recovered from the roadside where the unidentified woman's remains had been discovered. For years, those objects had been treated as clues without answers. Then, sometime around 2006, Detective Sergeant J. Michel began looking at the old case differently. He went through the evidence again. He examined the jewelry. And he noticed something that had been overlooked in the larger mystery. One of the rings was not simply jewelry. It was a high school class ring. Robert E. Lee High School. 1975. A small detail. But after 16 years, small details were all investigators had. The ring had an unusual blue stone. That stone had become the reason the unidentified woman was eventually called Princess Blue. But the ring itself contained something more important than its color. It contained a history. A school. A graduating class. A specific year. And potentially a person. Investigators began asking questions. Who had graduated from Robert E. Lee High School in 1975? Who had owned a ring like this? Had someone lost it? Had someone given it away? Could a former student recognize it? The class had included hundreds of students. And investigators eventually learned that the 1975 class had roughly 300 female graduates. 300 possible connections. 300 names. 300 lives. But none immediately solved the mystery. The manufacturer of the ring no longer had the records investigators wanted. The ring had also been resized. That was another problem. It had originally been approximately a size 7.5. It had later been enlarged to approximately a 9.5. The resizing may have removed or damaged earlier engravings. A detail that might once have identified the original owner could have disappeared when the metal was altered. Again, the clue existed. But it refused to speak. Investigators interviewed former students. They circulated information. They asked whether anyone remembered losing a class ring. Whether anyone had given one away. Whether someone remembered a young woman wearing it. The response was not enough. No definitive owner emerged. The blue ring remained attached to an unknown woman. And the unknown woman remained attached to a road. A road that had become the center of a mystery. The investigation also had another problem. The original forensic picture of the victim may have been wrong. In 1990, investigators believed the woman was probably between 15 and 19 years old. That estimate would influence the search. Missing teenage girls would become a major focus. But as the case aged, investigators and forensic specialists gained better tools. DNA analysis eventually provided information that could challenge assumptions made from the skeleton. And when the case was eventually linked to Julie Davis, investigators realized that the victim had been older than the original estimate. Julie was 18 when she disappeared. Later accounts place her age at approximately 20 when she died. The difference may seem small, but in a missing person investigation, even a few years can change everything. The databases searched. The photographs compared. The families contacted. The cases considered possible matches. A woman believed to be 15 might never be compared against the records of an 18-year-old missing person. A teenager believed to have disappeared in one state might never be connected to an adult woman who had moved across state lines. And that is exactly what made the Davis family connection so significant. Julie Gwen Davis had been missing from New Orleans since July 12, 1985. She had moved there from Orange, Texas. Then she disappeared. Her family did not know where she went. There was no body. No confirmed explanation. No final goodbye. Just silence. For years, Julie's disappearance remained separate from the Manville investigation. Her family was searching for a missing woman. Manville investigators were searching for the identity of unidentified remains. Neither side knew they were searching for the same person. That is how cold cases survive. Not because nobody cares, but because the pieces exist in different places. A missing person file can sit in one county. A body can be discovered in another. A family can wait in another city. And years can pass before the files ever touch. Julie had a history before she vanished. She had siblings. She had parents. She had memories. Her family remembered her returning home at different times. They remembered her life before New Orleans. They remembered the people around her. But one particular memory would eventually become especially important. Her brother Danny Davis remembered the last time he saw her. Julie came to the Jack Tar Hotel, where her family was staying. She was accompanied by a tall man with dark hair and a full dark beard. He was described as somewhat distant. Julie told her family that the man was her husband. But investigators later could not find a marriage license confirming the marriage. It may have been a common-law relationship. Or there may have been another explanation. What mattered was that Julie was not alone. Someone was with her. Someone her family remembered. And before Julie left, she hugged her younger brother. She told him she loved him. Then she walked away. That memory would remain with Danny for decades. At the time, he could not have known that it would become one of the last documented memories of Julie alive. He could not have known that within years, investigators would discover human remains in Manville. He could not have known that those remains would remain unidentified for almost 30 years. And he certainly could not have known that his own DNA would eventually connect his missing sister to the unidentified woman. But before that happened, the family had to live with uncertainty. Years passed. Then decades. Julie had disappeared before the age of the modern internet. Before social media. Before searchable national databases were available to ordinary families. Before DNA genealogy became a powerful investigative tool. The information about her disappearance existed, but it was fragmented. Her family had questions. Law enforcement had files. And Princess Blue had bones. The connection remained invisible. Then came 2019. The case received renewed public attention through ABC 13's 13 Unsolved series. The story of Princess Blue was broadcast again. The jewelry was discussed. The class ring was shown. The public was asked for information. A case that had been cold for years suddenly had a new audience. People who had never heard the name Princess Blue began looking at the details. And almost simultaneously in Orange, Texas, Danny Davis had provided DNA to a Texas Ranger. He was hoping investigators could use the sample to locate his missing sister. The timing was extraordinary. One investigation was asking the public to identify an unknown dead woman. Another was using DNA to search for a missing woman. Neither investigation was supposed to end with the other. But they did. When Danny's DNA entered the state database, it produced a match. The unidentified remains from Manville were related to him. Investigators compared the evidence. The probability became overwhelming. The woman known for nearly 30 years as Princess Blue was Julie Gwen Davis. Authorities announced that the identification was approximately 99.9% certain. The mystery of her identity was over. But for the Davis family, the moment was not a celebration. It was a collision with reality. For decades they had wondered whether Julie was alive. Maybe she had started another life. Maybe she had moved somewhere. Maybe she had chosen not to contact the family. Maybe she was living under another name. There had always been possibilities. Now there was only one truth. Julie was dead. Her remains had been discovered years earlier. She had been in the system all along. The family had been searching for a person who had already been found. And that realization carried its own kind of grief. Her parents had died in 1993. They never learned what had happened to their daughter. They never knew that Julie had been found. They never knew that her remains were only a few states away. They died with the same unanswered question that had haunted the family since her disappearance. Where is Julie? The answer came too late for them. But not too late for her siblings. The identification finally allowed the family to reclaim Julie's identity. The name Princess Blue was no longer necessary. She was Julie. And eventually, her remains were returned to her family. A woman who had once been treated as an unidentified body could finally be mourned by name. But detectives were not finished. Because the DNA match did not explain how Julie died. It did not explain why she ended up beside County Road 101. It did not identify the person who may have been with her. It did not establish the exact circumstances of her final days. And it did not erase the strange details surrounding the scene. There had been no purse. No wallet. No identification. No obvious personal documents. Her remains had been scattered among debris. Her jewelry remained. And the medical examiner had not been able to determine a definitive cause or manner of death. There were fractures to 2 ribs. There were other skeletal abnormalities. But no conclusion could explain the entire story. Toxicology did not provide a simple answer either. There were no drugs detected in the available testing that explained her death. The case remained difficult. And now investigators had something they had not possessed before. A real name. A real family. A real timeline of disappearance. A real photograph. A history. The question had changed. It was no longer, who is Princess Blue? It was now, what happened to Julie Davis? And that question was far more personal. Because Julie had not been an abstract, unidentified victim. She had been someone's daughter. Someone's sister. Someone who had once walked into a hotel room, hugged her younger brother, said she loved him and walked away. That final memory suddenly became much more painful. The tall man beside her. The unexplained marriage. The disappearance. The years of silence. And finally, the remains discovered in Manville. Investigators could not simply assume that the man was responsible. There was no public evidence establishing that he killed Julie. But his presence became part of the timeline. A person who had been near Julie during a period when her life was changing. A person the family remembered. A person investigators would naturally want to understand. Who was he? Where did he go? What happened after Julie left with him? Was he ever questioned? Did he know where she ended up? Could he explain how her life crossed from Louisiana into Texas? Or was he simply another person caught inside a tragedy whose ending nobody could see coming? Those questions remain important precisely because the case cannot be solved by suspicion. A name is not proof. A relationship is not proof. A memory is not proof. And a strange coincidence is not proof. Cold case investigators know this better than anyone. They have to separate what is known from what is believed. They have to distinguish evidence from theory. They have to reconstruct the truth from fragments that have survived decades of silence. For Julie, those fragments included a blue-stoned ring, a pearl bracelet, a few other pieces of jewelry, a skeletal examination, a missing person report, a brother's DNA, and a family memory that survived for decades. Together, those fragments finally answered one question. But the most important question remained untouched. Who was responsible for the end of Julie Gwen Davis's life? That question is why the case did not simply disappear after the identification. Manville police said they were continuing to work the case as a homicide investigation. They were following leads. They were speaking with people. They were attempting to reconstruct what happened. Because a case does not become complete simply because a victim has been named. For Julie's family, knowing her name was a beginning. For investigators, it was the beginning of a different investigation. One that no longer had to search through every missing woman in the country. One that could finally focus on Julie herself. Her movements. Her relationships. Her disappearance. And the years between the last time her family saw her and the day her bones were found beside a Texas road. Nearly 30 years had passed before Princess Blue became Julie. But time had not erased the questions. It had only buried them deeper. And somewhere between New Orleans and Manville, between a family searching for a missing woman and detectives examining unidentified remains, lies the missing chapter of Julie Davis's life. A chapter that began with a disappearance and ended with a skull inside an old tire. The blue ring helped preserve the mystery. DNA finally restored the name. But neither one could tell investigators what happened in the darkness between those two moments. And until that final piece is found, Julie Gwen Davis remains more than a solved identity. She remains a woman whose name came home. While the truth about her death is still waiting to be found. The name Julie Davis changed everything. For nearly 30 years, investigators have been staring at an unidentified woman. They had photographs of bones. They had sketches. They had jewelry. They had a class ring with a blue stone. They had a location. They had a date. But they did not have a person. Now they did. And suddenly, every old piece of evidence had to be viewed through a different lens. The woman on County Road 101 was no longer an anonymous teenager. She was Julie Gwen Davis, a young woman from Texas who had disappeared from New Orleans in 1985. Her family had spent decades wondering where she had gone. Investigators now knew that she had not simply vanished into another life. At some point, Julie had died. Her remains had been lying in Manville for months before they were discovered. Investigators estimated that she may have been there for roughly 6 months to a year. That meant her death likely occurred long before the man stopped beside the road in September 1990. The exact date was gone. The final location was known. The beginning of the disappearance was known. Everything in between was darkness. And that darkness became the new center of the investigation. Julie had disappeared from New Orleans on July 12, 1985. She had only recently moved there from Orange, Texas. Her family knew she was missing, but they did not know what had happened. For years, the family had no body to bury and no grave to visit. They had only memories. One of those memories involved Julie arriving at the Jack Tar Hotel in Galveston, where members of her family were staying. She was not alone. She was with a tall man. He had dark hair. He had a full beard. Julie introduced him to her family as her husband. That detail became important because investigators later found no confirmed marriage record establishing that Julie had actually been legally married. That does not prove anything about the man. It does not establish that he harmed Julie. It does not establish that he was responsible for her disappearance. But it does establish that someone was with Julie shortly before she vanished. And in a cold case where almost every minute of the victim's final days has disappeared, even a small memory can become enormous. Julie hugged her younger brother. She told him she loved him. Then she left. That moment would remain frozen in the family's memory. They did not know it was goodbye. Nobody ever does. A final hug does not announce itself as a final hug. A final conversation sounds ordinary while it is happening. A person walks through a doorway, gets into a vehicle, turns around, and disappears into the ordinary movement of life. Only later does that moment become sacred. Only later does the family realize that the last time they saw someone was the last time they would ever see them alive. For Julie's family, the years after her disappearance were filled with uncertainty. They did not have a body. They did not have a confirmed death. They did not know whether she was somewhere else. And every unidentified woman discovered across the country could potentially become a terrible possibility. That is the cruel nature of a missing person case. The family is trapped between hope and fear. If the person is alive, there is still a chance. If the person is dead, there should be answers. But when neither can be established, time becomes almost meaningless. 5 years. 10 years. 20 years. The calendar keeps moving. The missing person does not. Julie remained frozen in 1985. Princess Blue remained frozen in 1990. The two investigations existed separately for decades. Then DNA connected them. The match did more than identify the remains. It gave investigators a new starting point. Now they could examine Julie's life instead of searching for an unknown woman. They could ask who knew her, where she had lived, where she had traveled, who had been around her, and what had happened after she disappeared from New Orleans. But one of the most important clues from the original investigation remained the same. The jewelry. 6 rings had reportedly been found with the remains, along with a bracelet. There was no purse, no wallet, no clothing surrounding the skeleton. No identificación. That absence was striking. A young woman had been found with jewelry, but without the ordinary objects that might have connected her to a name. The class ring was especially unusual. Robert E. Lee High School. 1975. A bright blue stone. Investigators had originally assumed the ring might lead directly to the victim. It did not. Instead, it led to another mystery. Who had owned it? The class had hundreds of female graduates. The manufacturer no longer had the records needed to identify the purchaser. The ring had also been resized. That could have erased earlier markings. A clue had survived, but the information that once made the clue useful may have been destroyed. And that is what makes old evidence so frustrating. Sometimes the answer is physically present, but the part that would explain it is gone. The blue ring could tell investigators where it came from. It could tell them what school it was associated with. It could tell them the graduating year. But it could not tell them how it reached Julie. Was it hers? Was it a gift? Had someone given it to her years earlier? Had it belonged to a friend? A relative? Someone she had known? Or had it simply been passed from one person to another? Investigators never publicly established the full history of the ring. That uncertainty matters. Because the ring was the reason an unknown woman became Princess Blue. Yet the name may have created an illusion that the ring itself was the central mystery. It wasn't. Julie was. The ring was only a surviving fragment of her life. And the fragments that mattered most were the ones nobody could recover. Her conversations. Her movements. Her relationships. Her final journey. Her final hours. Her final day. Those were gone. What remained was physical evidence. And physical evidence can survive longer than memory. But it cannot always explain itself. The autopsy had produced few answers. The medical examiner could not determine exactly how Julie died. There were fractured ribs. There was a dental abnormality involving a surgically removed tooth. There was a defect near the knee. But there was no definitive fatal injury that explained the death. There were no drugs detected in the available testing that solved the mystery. The case therefore remained suspended. A woman had died. But investigators could not confidently state how. That distinction is critical. The identification of Julie did not automatically prove homicide. Her family believed she had been murdered. Authorities reopened the investigation into her death. But suspicion is not evidence. A person can disappear under mysterious circumstances without the available evidence proving who caused the death. That is why the investigation had to move carefully. The question was not simply who had known Julie. The question was who could be connected to the circumstances surrounding her death. And that meant returning to the timeline. July 1985. Julie disappears from New Orleans. Years pass. At some point she dies. Her remains eventually end up in Manville. The body remains unidentified until 2020. That timeline contains an enormous blank. It is the missing corridor between the woman who walked away from her family and the skeleton found beside County Road 101. Somewhere inside that corridor is the answer. Perhaps Julie traveled. Perhaps she remained in Louisiana. Perhaps she returned to Texas. Perhaps she was living under circumstances her family knew nothing about. Perhaps someone else knew exactly where she was. Every possibility had to be considered. But every possibility also needed evidence. And that is where the case becomes frustrating. There was no dramatic confession. No eyewitness who suddenly appeared with a complete account. No weapon recovered decades later with an unmistakable connection. No single document that explained the disappearance. Instead, there were fragments. A missing person report. A family memory. A class ring. A skeleton. DNA. And a man remembered from Julie's final known period. For investigators, the challenge was reconstructing a life from fragments, while resisting the temptation to fill the gaps with assumptions. That is the difference between a theory and a case. A theory can explain everything. A case requires proof. The public, however, does not always have the patience of an investigation. People want an answer. They want a name. They want a motive. They want to know who did it. They want the final scene. But cold cases rarely work that way. Sometimes the truth arrives in pieces. First, the victim gets a name. Then the timeline becomes clearer. Then old witnesses are located. Then forgotten relationships are examined. Then evidence is tested again. And sometimes, after decades, one surviving clue finally points toward the person responsible. For Julie, the first miracle was the DNA identification. The second would have to be something else. Something capable of crossing the decades between 1985 and the present. That could mean an old witness. An old photograph. An overlooked document. A surviving piece of physical evidence. Or a person who had remained silent for reasons known only to them. Because somewhere there may be someone who remembers Julie before she became Princess Blue. Someone who remembers where she went. Someone who remembers who she trusted. Someone who remembers the man who was beside her. Someone who knows why she disappeared. The question is whether that person is still alive. And if they are, whether they are willing to speak. Time can destroy evidence. But time can also create pressure. People age. Secrets become heavier. Relationships change. Friends fall out. Families reveal things they once kept hidden. Someone who remained silent for 10 years may speak after 20. Someone who was afraid in 1985 may no longer be afraid. And someone who believed the past was buried may discover that DNA has reopened it. That is the strange power of cold case investigations. The past does not necessarily stay buried. Sometimes it waits. Julie waited nearly 30 years for her name. Now her name is known. Her family knows where she was found. They know that the woman they searched for was finally located. But the most important part of the story remains missing. The final truth. The truth about the road. The truth about the disappearance. The truth about the person or circumstances that brought Julie Davis to the place where she would remain undiscovered for so long. And perhaps that is why the blue ring remains such a haunting symbol. For decades, investigators saw a piece of jewelry and wondered who had worn it. Today they know. Julie Gwen Davis wore the evidence of another person's past. And somehow, that small blue stone survived long enough to carry a piece of her story across 30 years of silence. It survived the weather. It survived the investigation. It survived the years when nobody knew her name. It survived while the people who loved Julie waited. And eventually it helped keep the case alive. But a ring cannot speak. Bones cannot speak. A DNA match can identify a family connection. It cannot reconstruct a final conversation. It cannot tell investigators what Julie was thinking when she left. It cannot tell them whether she knew she was in danger. It cannot tell them who she trusted. And it cannot tell them why the woman who once walked into a hotel room and hugged her brother eventually became a skeleton beside a Texas road. That story still exists somewhere. Maybe in a memory. Maybe in an old file. Maybe in the mind of someone who has never told anyone what they know. For almost 30 years, Julie's family waited for a name. They finally got one. Now the question is whether the same persistence that brought Julie home can finally bring the truth with her. Because Princess Blue was never supposed to remain a mystery forever. She was Julie. And Julie's story did not end when investigators finally learned her name. That was the moment the real question began. What happened to her? The question of what happened to Julie could no longer be separated from the people who had known her. For decades, the investigation had been forced to work backward from death. A skeleton had been discovered. Investigators had studied the remains. They had cataloged the jewelry. They had searched for a name. Only after the DNA match did the direction reverse. Now detectives could start with Julie herself. Her family. Her disappearance. Her movements. Her relationships. Her final known contacts. And somewhere inside that history was the possibility of an explanation. Julie Gwen Davis was not simply a woman who had appeared in Manville. She had a life before the roadside. She had grown up in Orange, Texas. She later moved to New Orleans. She had family members who remembered her. She had people who knew her personality. She had relationships that could be examined. And most importantly, she had once been alive in a world where somebody must have noticed when she disappeared. That is the paradox of missing person cases. A person can vanish physically, while remaining present in the memories of everyone who knew them. Julie disappeared. But she did not disappear from her family's thoughts. Her name remained. Her photographs remained. Her voice remained in memory. And one final encounter remained particularly vivid. Julie appeared at the Jack Tar Hotel while members of her family were staying there. She arrived with a man. Tall. Dark-haired. Full beard. Julie introduced him as her husband. The introduction may have seemed ordinary at the time. Families meet new partners all the time. A person walks into a room beside someone they love. People exchange names. They talk. They leave. Nobody expects that an ordinary meeting might later become evidence in a homicide investigation. But years later, that man became one of the last known people connected to Julie. The family could remember his appearance. They could remember his presence. But memory has limits. Names can fade. Addresses disappear. Phone numbers change. Relationships end. And the longer a case remains unsolved, the harder it becomes to determine which memories are exact and which have been altered by time. Still, the man's presence mattered. Not because it proved guilt. It did not. There was no public evidence establishing that he killed Julie. But because Julie was later found dead, investigators needed to understand everyone around her during the period leading to her disappearance. That is standard cold case logic. You start with the victim. Then you rebuild the circle around her. Family. Friends. Romantic partners. Employers. Neighbors. Acquaintances. People she trusted. People she argued with. People who may have known where she was going. People who may have seen her after the family stopped hearing from her. Every name becomes a potential piece of the timeline. But the timeline surrounding Julie was painfully incomplete. She disappeared in 1985. Her remains were discovered in 1990. That gap covered years. Years in which she could have traveled, moved, changed relationships, changed jobs, changed addresses, met new people, and perhaps lived a life that her family knew nothing about. The investigators therefore faced a fundamental problem. How do you reconstruct 5 years of a person's life when the final chapter is missing and the middle chapters are almost blank? The answer is usually records. Old records. School records. Employment records. Medical records. Financial records. Housing records. Photographs. Letters. Telephone records. Anything that can establish where someone was at a particular moment. But in a case from the 1980s, many of those records may never have existed in searchable digital form. Others may have been destroyed. Businesses close. Paper files disappear. Buildings are demolished. Employees retire. Witnesses move away. And people who might have known something can die before investigators ever reach them. That is the enemy of every cold case. Not only secrecy. Time. Time removes the people who can answer questions. Time destroys the documents that can confirm answers. Time changes places until investigators can barely recognize them. And time changes the memories of those who remain. For Julie's family, the passage of time had another consequence. Her parents died in 1993. They never learned that Julie had been found. They never knew that her remains were waiting in an unidentified case. They never had the opportunity to see the DNA match. They never had the chance to hear investigators say the words the family had been waiting for. Julie had been identified. That revelation came decades too late for them. And that fact gives the case a particularly painful dimension. A cold case does not only affect the person who died. It affects everyone left behind. Parents grow old. Siblings build families of their own. Children grow up without answers. Birthdays pass. Holidays pass.
Anniversary arrive.
And every year carries the same question. Where is she? For the Davis family, the answer eventually came from science. But science could not restore the years that had been lost. It could not give Julie's parents one final conversation with their daughter. It could not tell them what she experienced after leaving their lives. It could only say that the unidentified remains were hers. That distinction is devastating. Identification provides certainty about death. It does not provide an explanation for death. And that was exactly where the investigation stood. Julie had a name, but her final journey remained unknown. One of the most significant physical clues was still the jewelry. Investigators knew the remains had been found with multiple pieces. The jewelry could potentially tell a story about Julie's relationships. Jewelry is often personal. A bracelet can be a gift. A ring can represent a relationship. A class ring can represent a school, a friend, a family member, or a memory. But without provenance, an object can become almost impossible to interpret. The blue class ring was a perfect example. It was associated with Robert E. Lee High School and the class of 1975. Yet Julie was not a member of that graduating class. The ring had been resized. Its original owner remained uncertain. For investigators, that meant the object could not simply be treated as a direct identification. It was a clue. Nothing more. And clues become dangerous when assumptions replace evidence. The temptation is always to create a story. Maybe the ring belonged to a boyfriend. Maybe it belonged to a relative. Maybe Julie had received it from someone. Maybe it was connected to the man who accompanied her. Maybe it had nothing to do with her death at all. Each theory sounds possible. But possibility is not proof. That distinction becomes even more important when the case is discussed publicly. True crime stories often create the illusion that every mysterious object must have a dramatic meaning. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it is simply something a victim happened to possess. The truth may be less dramatic than the theory. But investigators cannot choose the most dramatic explanation. They have to choose the explanation supported by evidence. For Julie, the strongest evidence ultimately came not from the jewelry but from DNA. Her brother's genetic profile helped establish the family connection. That was the breakthrough that finally ended the identity mystery. And it also demonstrated something important. The original investigation had not necessarily failed because detectives did not care. They were working with the tools available at the time. In 1990, DNA databases were nothing like they are today. There was no modern consumer genealogy industry. There were no massive digital family trees available to investigators. There was no simple search box that could compare an unidentified victim against millions of relatives. The technology simply had not matured. So Princess Blue remained trapped in a biological mystery. Her body existed. Her family existed. But the bridge between them did not. Decades later, that bridge appeared. And once it did, the entire case changed. Investigators could finally place Julie's photograph beside the reconstruction of Princess Blue. They could compare her known history against the forensic evidence. They could tell the family that the woman they had been searching for had not disappeared voluntarily. She had died. The news was heartbreaking. But it also gave the family something they had been denied for years. A place to mourn. A place to remember. A name to say. A story to tell. Julie was no longer an unidentified woman in a Texas file. She was no longer merely Princess Blue. Yet the investigators still had to confront the hardest problem. There was no obvious answer for the manner of death. The remains had been exposed to the elements. Time had taken away much of the evidence. The condition of the skeleton limited what could be determined. There was no intact crime scene. There was no immediate witness. There was no person standing beside the body when investigators arrived. The scene had already been transformed by nature. That makes the difference between identifying a victim and proving a homicide enormous. A prosecutor eventually needs evidence that can survive scrutiny. A theory must become a chain. The victim must be connected to circumstances. Those circumstances must be connected to a person. And that person must be connected to an act. For Julie's case, that chain remained incomplete. The family could know what they believed. Investigators could have theories. The public could speculate. But none of that could replace evidence. The unknown man remained only a person of interest in the broader reconstruction of Julie's life, not a proven killer. The class ring remained only a clue. The roadside remained only the location where Julie's remains were discovered. And the cause of death remained unresolved. That is why the identification, although extraordinary, did not close the case. Instead, it created a new responsibility. To find out what happened after Julie left New Orleans. Investigators had to determine whether she remained in Louisiana, whether she returned to Texas, whether she traveled with someone, whether she used another name, whether she contacted anyone, whether anyone had seen her during the years between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains. Every surviving lead had to be reconsidered. Every old assumption had to be tested. And every person who had known Julie had to be viewed through a new timeline. Because once the unidentified woman had a name, the past could no longer hide behind anonymity. Someone had known Julie. Someone had seen her. Someone may have spoken with her shortly before she disappeared. Someone may have known where she was going. And someone may have known what happened afterward. That is the haunting possibility at the center of the case. The answer may not require a spectacular discovery. It may require one person to remember something they had forgotten. One document to survive. One photograph to reveal a face. One old relationship to be reconsidered. One witness to finally decide that silence has lasted long enough. Cold cases are often solved not by a single piece of evidence, but by the collision of many small truths. A name. A date. A location. A photograph. A memory. A DNA profile. One clue connects to another. Then another. Until a story begins to emerge from the fragments. For almost 30 years, Julie's story could not begin because investigators did not know who Princess Blue was. Now they do. And that means the remaining mystery is no longer invisible. It has a shape. It has a timeline. It has a victim. It has a family. And somewhere beyond those known facts is the person, or the event, that explains how Julie's life ended beside that lonely Texas road. The blue ring once gave an unidentified woman a temporary name. DNA gave her real one. But the final truth will require something science alone cannot provide. It will require someone to tell the story that Julie never had the chance to tell herself. And until that happens, the silence surrounding her death remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the case. The silence surrounding Julie's death was not empty. It was filled with fragments. A missing person report. A family photograph. A man's face remembered from decades earlier. A handful of pieces of jewelry. A blue class ring. A roadside discovery. And eventually a DNA match that crossed almost 30 years. But even after Julie's identity was confirmed, investigators still faced the most difficult part of the case. They had to determine whether the woman who disappeared in 1985 and the woman whose remains were discovered in 1990 could be connected through the years between those events. The answer was yes. The DNA had established that. But DNA could not fill every blank. It could not say where Julie lived during every month after she vanished. It could not identify every person she met. It could not establish who she trusted. And it could not tell investigators what happened during the final hours before her death. That is where the case became a reconstruction. Piece by piece. Memory by memory. Record by record. Investigators had to travel backward through time. They had to begin with Julie as a living person. Not Princess Blue. Not unidentified remains. Julie. A young woman from Orange, Texas. A woman who had eventually moved to New Orleans. A woman whose life had crossed state lines before ending in a completely different Texas community. That movement mattered. Because a disappearance is rarely confined to one location. People travel. They change addresses. They leave relationships. They take jobs. They meet strangers. They make plans that nobody else knows about. When a person disappears, investigators have to determine which of those ordinary movements became extraordinary. For Julie, one of the last known family memories placed her in the Galveston area. She had appeared at the Jack Tar Hotel. She was accompanied by a tall man with dark hair and a full beard. Julie identified him as her husband. Her family remembered the encounter. But the legal record did not provide a simple confirmation of that marriage. That created another unanswered question. Who was the man? And what role did he play in Julie's life? Again, the evidence does not allow investigators to turn an unanswered question into an accusation. There is no public proof that the man killed Julie. His presence is significant because he was remembered as someone close to her near the end of the family's known contact with her. That makes him part of the timeline. Nothing more should be assumed without evidence. But in a cold case, timelines matter. Sometimes the person who knows the answer is not the person investigators originally expected. Sometimes a witness remembers a detail that seemed meaningless decades earlier. Sometimes an apparently ordinary relationship becomes important only after a body is identified. And sometimes the person investigators need to find has been living an entirely ordinary life for decades. That possibility changes the nature of a cold case. The person responsible may not look like a fugitive. They may not have disappeared. They may have built a family, changed jobs, moved across the country, retired, aged. They may have told themselves that the past was finished. But the past has a way of returning. Especially when DNA enters the investigation. The identification of Julie demonstrated that old cases are not necessarily dead cases. A sample preserved for years can suddenly become useful. A relative can provide the missing genetic connection. A database can reveal a relationship that investigators could never have discovered through interviews alone. And once that happens, the old questions return with greater force. Where was Julie? Who was with her? Who last saw her? Who knew she was missing? Who knew where she was living? Who knew what happened after she disappeared? The family had waited for the first answer. Now investigators needed the second. What happened? The remains themselves offered only limited information. Approximately 60% of Julie's skeleton had been recovered. That was enough for identification. But not enough to reconstruct every detail of her death. 2 ribs were fractured. There were other findings from the skeletal examination. But decades of exposure had erased much of the evidence that a fresh body might have provided. This is one of the most brutal realities of forensic investigation. Time is not neutral. Every year changes the evidence. Bones deteriorate. Objects disappear. Animals move remains. Weather destroys biological traces. Human development changes the landscape. And memories become less reliable. A crime scene that might have been solved in days can become nearly impossible after decades. The location itself can become a historical artifact. County Road 101 in 1990 was not the same place it would become years later. Development transformed the surrounding area. Traffic patterns changed. New structures appeared. The landscape became busier. The isolation that once existed around the remains became difficult to imagine. Yet the discovery remained part of the area's history. Someone had found a skull there. Someone had called police. Investigators had recovered the bones. And a young woman had entered the records as an unidentified victim. For years, that was all the community knew. Then Julie's name returned. The story suddenly became personal. People who had followed the case could finally put a face to the remains. A family could finally understand that their missing daughter had not simply vanished. And investigators could finally begin asking questions that were impossible to ask when the victim was unidentified. But identification can also expose uncomfortable possibilities. If Julie had been missing since 1985, why had nobody identified the remains when they were discovered in 1990? Why had no missing person record immediately connected her to the unidentified woman? Why did it take almost 30 years for the two cases to meet? There is no single answer. The forensic estimate of the victim's age may have contributed. The geography may have contributed. The passage of time certainly contributed. And the technology available at the time was limited compared with today. But the result was the same. Julie became separated from her identity. Her family knew one person. Investigators knew another. The two were actually the same woman. For decades, nobody knew. That realization is one of the most haunting aspects of the case. The family did not fail to remember Julie. They remembered her. They searched for her. They carried her name. But the investigative system did not have the technology necessary to connect that name to the remains. The woman had effectively become invisible. Then DNA made her visible again. But once Julie was visible, another question appeared. Who had made her disappear? That question cannot be answered by the DNA identification alone. It requires a reconstruction of her life. And that reconstruction has to begin with the last confirmed moments. Julie at the hotel. Julie with the bearded man. Julie hugging her younger brother. Julie saying she loved him. Julie walking away. After that, the trail becomes increasingly difficult. What happened next? Did she return to New Orleans? Did she travel somewhere else? Did she remain in Texas? Did she meet someone? Did she become involved in another relationship? Did she tell anyone where she was going? Did she contact her family again? The answers could potentially exist in forgotten records. Or in someone's memory. The problem is that memories do not remain unchanged for 30 years. A person who saw Julie once in 1985 may remember the event differently decades later. A name might be wrong. A date might be off. A location might be confused with another. A face might be remembered only vaguely. That is why investigators need corroboration. One memory can generate a lead. Several independent pieces of evidence can generate a case. And the distinction between the two is enormous. The public often sees a cold case as a puzzle with one missing piece. In reality, it is often a puzzle where dozens of pieces have been damaged. Some are missing. Some are hidden. Some belong to another puzzle entirely. And investigators must determine which is which. For Julie, the blue class ring was one such piece. It looked important. It was distinctive. Created a nickname. It gave investigators a school and a year. But it did not identify the victim. The real breakthrough came through DNA. That fact should never be overlooked. The ring was memorable. The DNA was decisive. The distinction matters because it shows how easily a cold case can become dominated by its most visually striking clue. Princess Blue sounded like the name of a mystery. The blue ring looked like the key. But the solution came from something invisible. Genetic material. A biological connection. A brother's DNA. A scientific match. That is what finally broke the wall of anonymity. And once the wall collapsed, investigators could see the human being behind the nickname. Julie Gwen Davis. Not a symbol. Not a mystery. Person. Her family could finally tell her story. And that story made the case even more painful. Because Julie had not simply been an unidentified woman. She had been missing for years before her remains were ever found. The family had already suffered the uncertainty of disappearance. Then came the discovery of her death. The two traumas were separated by decades. First, they lost Julie without knowing why. Then they learned that she had been dead all along. And finally, they learned that her death remained unexplained. The emotional burden did not end with identification. Changed form. There was relief. There was grief. There was anger. And there were still questions. Why her? Why there? Why did she disappear? Who was with her? What happened between the last time her family saw her and the moment she became a case file? Those questions belong not only to investigators. They belong to Julie's family. Every unanswered question is another reminder that the story is incomplete. And incomplete stories have a way of remaining alive. The investigation therefore had to continue beyond the identification. Authorities needed to determine whether new evidence could establish the circumstances of Julie's death. That could mean revisiting old interviews, re-examining physical evidence, searching historical records, locating people who had been overlooked, or finding witnesses who had never understood the significance of what they knew. 30 years can make a witness difficult to find. But it can also make a witness more willing to speak. People change. Secrets become burdens. Relationships end. Old loyalties weaken. And sometimes a person reaches a point in life when they decide that silence is no longer worth carrying. That is one of the few advantages time can offer a cold case investigation. Time destroys evidence. But sometimes time creates distance from fear. A person who once refused to speak may eventually decide to talk. A person who once protected someone may no longer have a reason to do so. A person who once believed the truth would never surface may realize that the case has returned. And Julie's case did return. Her identity was recovered. Her family was found. Her story became public again. The old evidence was no longer dormant. It had become active. The blue ring was no longer simply a curiosity. The unidentified remains were no longer anonymous. The missing person case was no longer separate. Everything had converged on one name: Julie. That convergence gave investigators something that had been missing for decades: a direction. But direction is not the same as destination. Knowing where to look does not mean knowing what you will find. And the final answer still remained hidden. Somewhere between New Orleans and Manville. Somewhere between July 1985 and September 1990. Somewhere between the last family goodbye and the discovery of the remains. There was a story. Julie knew it. The person who was with her may have known it. Someone else may have seen part of it. And perhaps one of those people still carries the missing piece. The blue ring survived almost 30 years. Julie did not. Her family survived the uncertainty. The investigation survived the decades. And now the case survives for one reason. Because a name was recovered. But justice has not yet followed. The woman once called Princess Blue finally came home as Julie Gwen Davis. Her identity is no longer a mystery. Her death is. And until that final mystery is solved, every surviving clue carries the same silent question. What happened to Julie after she walked away? What happened after Julie walked away remains the darkest space in the timeline. There is a final known moment. A family remembers her. A man is beside her. Julie says goodbye. Then she disappears from the known record.
No dramatic announcement.
No final message. No warning. Just a gap. And inside that gap, investigators have spent decades searching for a sequence of events that can be proven. The difficulty is that disappearance does not always leave a clean trail. A person can leave a building without anyone noticing. A vehicle can travel across state lines without creating a permanent record. A relationship can end without documentation. Person can stop calling home. Then days become weeks. Weeks become months. And eventually, a missing person becomes a cold case. Julie had disappeared long before the world became accustomed to digital footprints. There were no smartphones tracking locations. No social media posts documenting every movement. No GPS history. No massive digital archive containing photographs and messages. Much of her life existed on paper, in people's memories, and in the physical objects she carried. That made the investigation extraordinarily difficult. The people who knew Julie had to become the archive. And memories can be fragile. Her family remembered her. They remembered her appearance. They remembered her personality. They remembered the man who accompanied her. They remembered the hotel. They remembered the goodbye. But none of them could see the future. Nobody knew that Julie would vanish. Nobody knew that years later, investigators would recover her remains. Nobody knew that her identity would remain unresolved until DNA finally connected the remains to her family. That is why the final goodbye is so haunting. It was ordinary. There was nothing in Julie's behavior that necessarily announced danger. She hugged her brother. She said she loved him. Then she left. A moment that probably lasted less than a minute would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because after that moment, Julie's family no longer knew where she was. And when investigators eventually identified Princess Blue, they realized that the goodbye had been final. But where did Julie go? The answer remains incomplete. Investigators know she had connections to both Texas and Louisiana. They know she had lived in New Orleans. They know she had family in Texas. They know she disappeared in 1985. They know her remains were discovered near Manville in 1990. But a person's life cannot be reconstructed simply by connecting 2 points on a map. There must have been hundreds of decisions between them. Places. People. Conversations. Vehicles. Rooms. Meals. Jobs. Arguments. Promises. Perhaps even plans for the future. Every one of those moments could contain a clue. The challenge is finding the one that matters. The discovery of Julie's remains in Manville created another geographical mystery. Why Manville? Why that particular stretch of road? The location was relatively isolated when the remains were discovered. That could have made it attractive to someone who wanted a body to remain hidden. But again, that does not prove that Julie was murdered there. Her remains may have been transported. She could have died somewhere else. The location where remains are discovered is not necessarily the location where a death occurred. That distinction is fundamental. Investigators cannot simply assume that the roadside was the scene of the crime. They have to ask whether Julie was killed there or brought there afterward. And if she was transported, by whom? How? From where? When? Those questions create an enormous investigative tree. Every branch leads somewhere. But only one branch leads to the truth. The condition of the remains made the task harder. Investigators recovered approximately 60% of the skeleton. That was enough for forensic analysis. But not enough to preserve every piece of evidence. The natural environment had already taken its toll. The body had been exposed. Time had passed. The remains had been scattered. Whatever biological evidence might once have existed could have been lost. This is why the first investigators had such a difficult task. They were not examining a fresh crime scene. They were examining the remains of a person who had already been dead for months. The difference is enormous. At a fresh scene, investigators can establish patterns. Blood can reveal movement. Bodies can reveal position. Objects can preserve fingerprints. Clothing can retain fibers. Vehicles can retain biological traces. Phones can preserve communications. But after months or years, those clues may vanish. Nature does not preserve a crime scene for investigators. Nature destroys it. And in Julie's case, nature had almost 30 years to erase the story before her identity was finally recovered. The irony is that the most valuable clue survived anyway. DNA. Not necessarily from the crime scene. Not necessarily from Julie herself in a way that immediately identified her. But through her family. Her brother's genetic information became the bridge. The bridge connected a missing person case to unidentified remains. And suddenly, investigators had the answer to the question that had defeated them for decades. Who was Princess Blue? Julie. The identification was announced in 2020. Nearly 30 years after the discovery. More than 3 decades after Julie disappeared. A name that had been absent from the case file for years finally appeared. Julie Gwen Davis. The announcement was significant for another reason. It demonstrated that the case had never truly been forgotten. Someone had continued working. Someone had preserved the evidence. Someone had revisited the old file. Someone had submitted DNA. Someone had searched. That persistence matters. Cold cases are often solved because someone refuses to accept that an unanswered question has to remain unanswered. Detectives retire. Departments change. Technology changes. But evidence can remain. A ring can remain. A photograph can remain. A DNA profile can remain. And sometimes decades later those pieces become useful. Yet the identification also revealed a painful limitation. Science could tell investigators who the woman was. Science could not tell them why she died. The remains did not provide a definitive cause of death. The circumstances remained unclear. The case therefore entered a new stage. The identity was solved. The death remained unexplained. For Julie's family, that distinction mattered enormously. They could finally stop wondering whether she was alive. But they could not stop wondering who was responsible for losing her. There is a difference between closure and certainty. Knowing that a missing person is dead can provide a form of closure. But knowing how they died can be something else entirely. Families often need the second answer. They want to know what happened. They want to know whether their loved one suffered. They want to know whether someone caused the death. They want accountability. And they want the person responsible to understand that the passage of time did not erase the victim. Julie was not erased. Her name returned. Her family returned to her story. And the investigation returned to the unanswered circumstances of her death. One of the most important things investigators could now do was compare Julie's known history against the unidentified case. The class ring suddenly had a different meaning. It was no longer potentially the victim's identity. It was evidence associated with her remains. That distinction allowed investigators to separate what was known from what had merely been assumed. The ring was associated with Robert E. Lee High School's 1975 class. But Julie was not a member of that graduating class. Therefore, the ring's connection to Julie had to be explained separately. Could have been a gift. It could have belonged to someone she knew. It could have been passed through several hands. It could even have had no connection to the circumstances of her death. The public might naturally want the ring to be the key. But the real key had already been found. It was Julie's DNA connection to her family. The ring had helped create the legend. DNA had destroyed the anonymity. And now investigators needed something else. Evidence of what happened. That evidence might be hidden in the years Julie spent in New Orleans. It might exist in the memories of people who knew her. It might exist in the identity of the man who accompanied her. It might exist in a missing document. Or it might exist in a person who has never been identified publicly. The case therefore becomes a question of human memory. Someone knew Julie. Someone knew where she was. Someone may have known where she was going. Someone may have seen her after her family did. Someone may have noticed when she stopped appearing. Someone may have heard something unusual. And if that person still exists, their memory could become the most valuable evidence in the case. But there is another possibility. The person who knows what happened may not realize that they know. A witness may have seen Julie without understanding who she was. A worker may have remembered a vehicle. A neighbor may have remembered an argument. A hotel employee may have remembered a couple checking in. A friend may have remembered a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time. Cold case investigators often search for precisely these fragments. Not someone who witnessed a murder. Someone who witnessed a life. Because a person's final days are usually made of ordinary moments. The last meal. The last phone call. The last trip. The last conversation. The last person they trusted. Only afterward do those moments become evidence. And that means someone somewhere may possess a memory they have never understood as important. The challenge is finding that person. And then convincing them to speak. Decades can create fear. They can create loyalty. They can create guilt. They can create indifference. A witness may think the information is too old to matter. Another may believe they will not be believed. Someone may have forgotten the significance of what they saw. And someone else may deliberately choose silence. That is why cold case investigations are so often about patience. There is no guarantee of a breakthrough. There is no guarantee that the final witness will appear. There is no guarantee that the evidence survived. But the existence of an unanswered question can keep investigators looking. For Julie, that question is particularly powerful because one enormous mystery has already been solved. Her name is known. That means the remaining mystery is narrower. And narrower mysteries can sometimes be solved. The investigation no longer has to identify the victim. It has to reconstruct her final years. It has to determine what happened after she disappeared. And it has to establish whether her death resulted from criminal conduct. Those are difficult questions. But they are questions that can be asked now. Because Julie is no longer invisible. Her photograph can be shown. Her name can be searched. Her family can tell investigators what she looked like, how she behaved, who she knew, and what she was like before she vanished. Her DNA can confirm relationships. Her old records can be compared. And every new piece of information can be tested against the timeline. The woman once called Princess Blue now has a history. And history leaves more traces than anonymity ever could. That is why the identification was not the end. It was the moment the silence changed. For nearly 30 years, investigators asked, "Who is she?" Now they can ask, "Who knew her? Who saw her last? Where did she go? And what happened after she disappeared?" Those questions are harder. But they are no longer impossible. Because somewhere beneath the years of silence, the truth still exists. The blue ring survived. The DNA survived. The family survived. And Julie's name survived. What remains is the final piece. The piece that explains why a young woman disappeared from the lives of those who loved her. And why her remains eventually appeared beside a Texas road. Until that piece is found, Princess Blue may have a name. But Julie Davis still does not have the full story of what happened to her. And that is the mystery that refuses to die. There was one moment in the investigation when the case stopped being a story about an unidentified woman, and became a story about a family. It happened when Danny Davis gave investigators his DNA. He was not trying to solve the mystery of Princess Blue. He was trying to find his sister. Julie Davis had been missing for decades, and her family still did not know what had happened to her. Danny provided his DNA to a Texas Ranger who was investigating whether Julie might be among unidentified remains somewhere in Texas. At that moment, he had no reason to believe that the answer was sitting inside an old Manville case file. Then the database produced a match. The woman whose bones had been discovered beside County Road 101 was Julie Gwen Davis. The probability was reported at 99.9%. 30 years of anonymity collapsed in a single result. Princess Blue had a name. But the moment of identification also created a devastating realization for Julie's family. They had not been searching for a woman who was still missing. They had been searching for a woman who had already been found. Her remains had been sitting in the investigative system since 1990. Her family had been living without answers while the woman they loved had already become evidence. And now, after decades of uncertainty, the family had to confront the truth. Julie was dead. The identification was announced in June 2020. 5 months later, her remains were returned to the Davis family. For the first time in decades, they could finally say goodbye to Julie by name. But there was something deeply unsettling about that reunion. The family could bring Julie home. They could mourn her. They could remember her. But they could not explain her death. The medical examiner had never been able to determine exactly how she died. The available evidence showed a couple of fractured ribs, but no definitive cause or manner of death. Toxicology did not reveal drugs that explained the circumstances. When investigators found her remains, there was no purse and no identification. What remained was primarily bone and a handful of personal items. That meant the case had crossed an invisible line. The identity mystery was solved. The death mystery remained. And those are two very different investigations. For almost 30 years, detectives had asked one question. Who is Princess Blue? Now they could ask another. What happened to Julie? The difference sounds simple. It was anything but. Julie had disappeared from New Orleans on July 12, 1985, shortly after moving there from Orange, Texas. She was 18 years old. Her family knew she was missing, but the connection between her disappearance and the unidentified remains discovered 5 years later was never made until DNA technology finally bridged the gap. That 5-year gap became one of the most important periods in the investigation. Where was Julie? Who was she with? Where did she live? Who saw her? Who spoke with her? And when did her life end? Investigators could place Julie at the beginning of the timeline. They could place her remains at the end. But between those 2 points was a dark corridor of missing information. And that corridor was now the target. The family had memories. Investigators had old reports. The case had physical evidence. But none of those pieces alone could reconstruct Julie's final journey. One clue continued to attract attention. The class ring. It had been found with the remains and was engraved with the name of Robert E. Lee High School in Houston, and the year 1975. Its bright blue stone gave the unidentified woman her nickname, Princess Blue. Investigators spent years trying to trace the ring back to the 1975 graduating class. But the ring did not belong to Julie as a member of that graduating class. She would have been too young. That created an entirely different mystery. How did Julie come to possess it? A gift was one possibility. A family connection was another. It could have belonged to someone she knew. It could have passed through several hands. Investigators knew that the ring had been resized, and the manufacturer did not retain the records from 1975 that might have identified its original purchaser. The graduating class included roughly 300 girls, making the search even more difficult. The ring therefore remained a clue without a definitive owner. And that is where the case demands caution. A mysterious object can create an irresistible theory. But a theory is not evidence. The blue stone was visually striking. The class year was specific. The school was identifiable. The object looked like it should contain the answer. Yet the actual breakthrough came from something far less dramatic. DNA. The difference is important. The ring helped keep the mystery alive. DNA solved the identity. The ring gave the unidentified woman a nickname. DNA gave her back her real name. Julie. For her family, that name carried decades of memories. For investigators, it transformed the entire case. Now they could search for Julie's known history. They could compare her known relationships against the evidence. They could revisit the circumstances of her disappearance. They could ask people who had known her to remember details they might never have considered important. And that process inevitably brought attention back to the people who were around Julie before she disappeared. Her brother remembered seeing her with a man. He described him as tall, with dark hair and a full beard. Julie had introduced the man as her husband. Her family remembered the encounter. But that memory, like every other piece of evidence in a cold case, had to be handled carefully. The man's presence does not establish that he was responsible for Julie's death. There is no basis for presenting him as a killer without evidence. But he is part of the known story. He was someone Julie trusted enough to appear with. Someone her family remembered. Someone whose identity and movements could potentially help investigators reconstruct the missing period. That is the difference between a person of interest and a proven perpetrator. A cold case investigation cannot jump from suspicion to guilt. It has to build a chain of evidence. And Julie's chain still had missing links. The most important missing link was time. 5 years. 5 years between her disappearance and the estimated period in which her remains were left in Manville. The exact date of death could not be established. Investigators believed her remains had been there for months before discovery, but the precise circumstances remained uncertain. That means the case cannot simply be reduced to a single night. It is possible that Julie's final chapter lasted days, weeks, or longer. There may have been a final journey. There may have been multiple locations. There may have been people who saw her without realizing that she would soon become a missing person. And that is what makes the investigation so difficult. The person who could solve Julie's case may not have witnessed her death. They may have seen her days earlier. They may have spoken with her. They may have driven past her. They may have known where she was staying. They may have remembered a relationship that seemed insignificant at the time. 30 years can turn an ordinary memory into critical evidence. But only if someone remembers. And only if someone speaks. The investigation had another obstacle. The original scene had already deteriorated beyond recognition. When the remains were found in 1990, investigators recovered about 60% of the skeleton. There was jewelry. There was a skull inside the rim of an old tire. But the location had already become a place where evidence could be lost to weather, time, and exposure. There was no fresh crime scene. No immediate witness. No intact set of circumstances. No simple answer. The remains themselves could not tell investigators whether Julie had been killed at the location or transported there. That distinction remains crucial. A body discovered at a location does not automatically mean the death occurred there. If Julie died somewhere else, then County Road 101 may represent only the final destination of her remains. If she died there, then investigators need to know why she was brought to that particular place. Either possibility creates another set of questions. Who knew the location? Who had access to a vehicle? Who had a reason to travel there? Who knew the road? Who could have moved the remains without attracting attention? Again, none of these questions proves anything. They simply define the investigative landscape. And the landscape is enormous. That is why the identification of Julie was so important. Before 2020, investigators were searching for a person whose identity was unknown. After 2020, they were searching for the circumstances surrounding one specific woman's death. The difference is enormous. They could now ask her family about her. They could look for people connected to her. They could compare old photographs. They could reconstruct her movements. They could revisit records that previously seemed unrelated to the unidentified remains. The case had finally acquired a human history. But the human history also made the unanswered questions more painful. Julie had parents who never learned what happened to her. Her parents died in 1993. They never lived to see the DNA match. They never learned that their daughter had been identified. They never received the answer they had spent years waiting for. That is one of the cruelest features of a cold case. The breakthrough can come too late for the people who needed it most. A detective can solve a mystery 30 years later. A family may no longer be there to hear the answer. Technology can move forward. People cannot. The case can survive. The witnesses may not. The evidence can be preserved. The memories can disappear. That is why every remaining lead matters. Because the longer Julie's case remains unresolved, the more fragile the remaining evidence becomes. People who knew her are aging. People who knew the man who was with her may have moved. Documents may have vanished. And memories that once seemed crystal clear may now exist only as fragments. Yet the case has something it did not have before. It has a name. It has a family. It has a photograph. It has a DNA connection. And it has a story that can finally be told accurately. For almost 30 years, the public knew a mysterious woman as Princess Blue. Now they know she was Julie Gwen Davis. The nickname may have created the legend. But Julie's real life is what matters. Because behind the blue stone was an 18-year-old woman whose family wanted her home. Behind the skeleton was a missing daughter. Behind the cold case file was a life. And behind the unanswered question of her death is the possibility that someone somewhere still knows more than they have said. That is the part of the case that remains unresolved. The identity is no longer hidden. The family is no longer searching for a name. The remains are no longer anonymous. But the truth about Julie's final days is still buried beneath years of silence. And every unanswered detail points toward the same disturbing possibility. Someone may remember what happened. Someone may have known where Julie went. Someone may have seen her after her family last did. And if that person is still alive, they may be carrying the one piece of information that could finally turn Princess Blue from a solved identity into a solved case. Until then, Julie's name has come home. Her remains have come home. Her family has finally been able to mourn her. But the final answer remains somewhere out there. Waiting. For nearly 30 years the question was, who is Princess Blue? Now there is only one question left. Who took Julie's future away from her? And why has the truth remained silent for so long?